Happy Tuesday to you all. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm the mayor of Geneva, Illinois. I'm the Environment Committee and Energy Subcommittee Chairperson for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, and I'm the Executive Board Chairman for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. All of you will echo virtually everything I say. Air quality has improved steadily since the implementation of the Clean Air Act of 1970. Some of us were actually alive when that Clean Air Act was implemented. However, our region is still considered, quote, non-attainment, end quote, to certain air quality standards. The sources of these air pollutants are diverse and, of course, all around us. Air pollutant cross political boundaries, contributes to ground level ozone, and cause public health impacts. We don't often think of air quality as an issue that municipalities have much influence over. However, to tell us otherwise are our colleagues from the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium, otherwise known as LADCO, a multi-jurisdictional organization that guides air quality policy and program in the Great Lakes states. Our friend Zach Edelman is the executive director of LADCO. He describes his personal mission to use science and collaboration to lead people to develop evidence-based solutions to difficult environmental problems. He has a bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His colleague and our friend Mark Jansen has been the emissions director at LADCO for over 25 years. He helped implement the first emissions models at LADCO for the Lake Michigan Ozone Study Project, and was the lead emissions inventory developer for the Ozone Transport Assessment Group and regional haze process. He earned his bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first speaker and perhaps our only speaker, since Mark will be in a supportive role, Zach Edelman. Zach, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor Burns. I really appreciate Edith for inviting me to speak with you all today. I hope not to be the only speaker over the next hour and a half, that we can have some interactive discussion here.
Yes.
I have some questions that I'll be posing to test your knowledge on air pollution, and also to think through, I think together here, what types of solutions we can envision for the region and for leaders in the municipalities in the region. Let me share my screen and bring up the slides that I have. Let's see here. Okay, can everybody see this?
Looks good.
Sure can.
Looks good, okay. Get my laser pointer in here, all right. So I put these slides together with Mark, our emissions director. Mark has been working on air quality in the Great Lakes region in Chicago for 30 years. So Mark really is an expert on the sources of air pollution and different experiences with trying to, control those sources. And so, he is the Great Lakes air pollution expert. I've been with LADCO here for about 7 years. But I bring a background in air pollution chemistry and modeling, and in consensus building across different stakeholder groups, which is needed as we think about solving air pollution problems. We're really going to dive into a lot of topics today. We're going to start with an overview of air pollution in the Great Lakes region in Chicagoland. What are the air pollution problems that we have and why? I'm going to give you an update on the regulatory landscape. What are the regulatory mandates that are out there that are facing policymakers in Chicago, and what are the implications? We'll talk a bit about air pollution emissions. What are the important sources of air pollution in Chicago? And then I hope to wrap things up with a discussion about air pollution management and the role for you all in the municipalities. To start with, LADCO, the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium, has been around for about 30 years. Mark started here at LADCO not long after it was founded. We're funded by a US EPA grant, the same grant that funds the state regulatory programs. And we were formed, LADCO was formed, frankly, as a result of litigation. Wisconsin, coastal Wisconsin and coastal Michigan, beautiful, pristine areas, have some of the worst air pollution in the country because they're downwind of Chicago and the industry in Northwest Indiana. Illinois and, or rather, Wisconsin and Michigan needed to have a table around which they could sit with Illinois and Indiana to talk about air pollution mitigation strategies. They couldn't go at it alone because the sources were outside of their regulatory jurisdiction. So in 1989, a study was established, a research study. Measurements were made, and also LADCO was formed to help run the study, understand what the data were telling us, and to create the table around which these states could sit to talk about regional air pollution strategies. There are other multi-jurisdictional organizations across the country. This is a unique kind of regulatory apparatus that we have in the United States, where we realized 30, 40 years ago or so that we had municipal and state air pollution planning agencies. We had the Federal Air Pollution Planning Agency and the EPA, but there was nothing in between. And there was a need for regional consortiums for the states and the regions to get together to work on air pollution planning. And this was essentially the foundation of the multi-jurisdictional organizations. Our membership shown here, the 6 states in the Great Lakes Basin. Our board are the directors of the state air pollution programs. If any of you know Julie Armitage with Illinois EPA, she's one of our board members. And again, we're a forum for state agency staff to work on air pollution issues. We're modelers and data scientists, so we do decision support. We don't provide policy guidance to our membership. We're primarily a technical guidance and support agency. We help our states understand why there's air pollution and what they can do about it. And we also provide some training. So we take federal funding and turn that around into a capacity building or training program for the states. So this is, essentially what we do. I mentioned it's a lot of data science, a lot of modeling, mapping. Why do we have air pollution, and what can we do about it? But today, let's start talking about air pollution trends. Mayor Burns described the significant improvements that we've had in air pollution in the Chicago area, in Illinois, and across the country since the advent of the Clean Air Act in the 70s. This is all true. I'll show you some trends that look at that. But what are the air pollution issues that we have in Chicago? Big urban area, heavy industry, heavy industrial legacy, a hub of transportation and freight. And I boiled it down to basically 4 main pollutants. And these issues are not unique to Chicago. When you have a big urban area, we typically see these issues across the country. Chicago is called it's a non-attainment area, as Mayor Burns mentioned, for ozone. Ground level ozone is bad. Ozone aloft, like the ozone layer, is good. So ozone up in the stratosphere filters out UV radiation. But when ozone forms at the surface, it's a secondary pollutant. Nothing emits ozone. Ozone is formed by primary pollutants. When ozone forms at the surface, it's a very strong oxidant, and it's quite harmful. It's a summertime pollutant. It forms in warm, sunny conditions. It's a regional scale pollutant, meaning that you don't have like neighborhood to neighborhood gradients for the most part in ozone. You get these big ozone plumes that form over the region, and the health effects are primarily respiratory. Sources of ozone precursors include combustion sources, so burning anything produces a pollutant called nitrogen oxides, NOx, that combines in the presence of sunlight with volatile organic compounds, which is another type of pollutant, VOCs. VOCs come from fuels. The smell of gasoline The smell of solvents, those are volatile organic compounds. Those are VOCs. So VOCs combine with NOx in the presence of sunlight, warm conditions, and you get ozone. Another pollutant that we have problems with in Chicago is particulate matter. These are very tiny, small particles in the atmosphere. The particulate matter can happen at any time in the year, but our peak seasons are in the winter and the summer for different reasons. Particulate matter can be both primary and secondary, regional and local. So you can have very local sources of PM pollution. When you're driving by a hamburger place and you see the smoke and you smell the smoke and the grilling, you're really smelling and experiencing the particles from the cooking. But then there's also regional PM as well. Last summer, we experienced wildfire smoke coming in from Canada. This was like a regional PM episode. There are pretty scary health effects when you dig into the literature about what particulate matter does to the human body. There are respiratory impacts, cognitive impacts. There was this really fascinating study that came out of Columbia University a couple of years ago, where the researchers created this app, an iPhone app, which was a game. And the game tested kind of cognitive functioning. I don't think the players totally understood that their cognitive functioning was being tested, but it was like a fun game. And when they looked at the scores of this game in different parts of the country, you know, because they could see where people were playing the games on their phones, they found a statistically significant correlation between the lower scores, declining cognitive functioning, and the presence of fire smoke. So where they saw people playing this game, and there was fire smoke in the area, they saw a significant deficit in the score. So there are a lot of well-established health impacts related with particulate matter exposure, and there are a lot of sources of PM. Some of the same sources as precursors to ozone, combustion sources, fuels and solvents. But then you also have things like fires, agriculture, dust, of course. Another pollutant that we have issues with in dense urban areas are air toxics. These are not, there's no seasonal signature. These are mostly local scale sources. They are carcinogenic, mutagenic, respiratory, gasoline. The chemicals in gasoline are air toxics, for example. So the sources are things like solvents and surface coatings, personal care products, fuels, and also combustion. And then finally, nitrogen oxides. When the atmosphere is 70% molecular nitrogen N2. Whenever you burn anything in the atmosphere, whenever you combust anything in the atmosphere, you end up with nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides are a precursor to ozone and particulate matter, meaning they form through chemical reactions to form ozone and particulate matter. But nitrogen oxide is also a pollutant. It's a national ambient air quality. It's a criteria pollutant in and of itself. And there are respiratory health effects associated with NOx. So these are kind of the four classes of pollutants that we're really contending with in Chicago, and we have non-attainment areas for ozone and particulate matter now. So let's look at ozone, and we're going to focus a bit more on ozone and PM in this presentation. The charts on the left are showing trends in ozone concentrations for all of the monitors in Chicago. If you look at the chart to the right, you can see these dots are monitors that are on the ground. These are surface monitors located throughout the Chicagoland area. This pink polygon represents the Chicago non-attainment area. So if we average year to year the values in these monitors, you kind of see these trends. The gray line is the average of all the monitors. The light gray lines are the concentrations for every monitor going back from 2001 to 2020. 2001 to 2023. And so, you can kind of see there was a downward trend in ozone up until about 2013, 2014. And then things have kind of flattened out bounced around a little bit. Ozone is very dependent on temperature. And so if we had a cool year, we would have lower ozone on average. If we had a warm year on average, we would have higher ozone. So after seeing a pretty significant drop through the 2000s and into the early 2010s, ozone concentrations have kind of stabilized. And in some cases, like last year, we saw a big increase. Last year was pretty warm. We had a lot of wildfire smoke. And so we saw ozone concentrations increase. If you look at where we have ozone problems over here on the map, the orange and the red colored monitors represent monitors that are exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone. These red lines on the plot, the solid red line represent the level of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, seven parts per billion ozone. And so you can see almost every monitor in the Chicago region based on an average of 3 years, 2021 to 2023. There's this averaging metric called the design value that EPA uses to determine whether you're in or out of attainment of the standard. And it's this 3-year average that we look at, this regulatory metric. So if you look at the most recent 3-year average, recent year of complete data that we have going back through last year, 2023, you can see almost every monitor in Chicago is violating the ozone standard. And then there are some monitors outside of Chicago as well. Downstate, you have to get down into St. Louis before you find other monitors in Illinois that are violating the standard. You can see the highest monitors in our region, the red ones, the ones with the highest concentrations, are all along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Question. Does anybody know why ozone concentrations tend to be highest near the lakeshore? So you see all these monitors around here. Why is it that we have high ozone at the lakeshore?
Chime in if you think you know the answer. I'm going to guess precipitation.
Precipitation, okay.
Am I the only one guessing here?
I'll take a guess at this because the emissions have time to cook and the chemical reactions take place and combined with sunlight, maybe?
Yeah. Why at the lakeshore though?
Temperature differential.
Yep. Cooking, temperature differential, I like it.
And it's
Okay.
further east, everything's moving east.
Things are blowing east, exactly, yeah, okay. So we have this very complex dynamic at the lakeshore, the land breeze, lake breeze interface. So the atmosphere is basically layered based on temperature gradients. And, if you think of summertime heat conditions, warm air rises, you have over the land in the summer, a deeper, what we call boundary layer. The atmosphere has more volume. And over the lake, the cool temperatures of the lake keep the atmosphere compressed at the shallower boundary layer. And so what happens is at night and in the early morning, you have actually warmer lake temperatures than you do over land. And so you actually have a bit more volume over the lake than you do over the land. And what that does is you create this outflow, a land breeze, a flow coming from the land over the lake. And so you have this outflow and this kind of circulation pattern going from land to lake that comes around like this. So all of the emissions from the cars, from industry, are blowing out over the lake. And in the morning, the sun rises and the boundary layer on the land starts to increase because it warms up and it compresses over the lake. And you get a cooking of the smog over the lake. So the emissions concentrate in this less voluminous atmosphere over the lake, and it cooks up through these chemical reactions, and you start to get things like ozone and other nasty pollutants. And then early afternoon, we have a shift from a land breeze to a lake breeze. So you have all these concentrated pollutants over the shallow boundary layer over the lake. The boundary layer over land, as the land heats up through the course of the morning into the afternoon, and you get a lake breeze. And then you have this shift and you have an inflow coming from the lake to the land. And we see these very tight spatial and temporal gradients. From 1 hour to the next, you get these big jumps and spikes in ozone pollution as the lake breeze sets up. If any of you if you go to a day game at Wrigley Field, you can actually see the lake breeze shift happen. You know, noon when the game starts up, you know, if there are lake breeze conditions, and this usually happens earlier in the season, April, May, June. You look out at the flags in the outfield, you can see them blowing out towards the lake, away from home plate. By 1, 2, 3 o'clock, as you get towards the end of the game, you'll often see those flags in the outfield shifting back in towards home plate. That's the lake breeze setup. Seems nice. You get a nice breeze coming in off the lake. It helps cool things down. Unfortunately, that's also associated often with high pollution coming in off of the lake. And this is a very unique situation that we have around Lake Michigan, and is the reason why we have really high ozone problems and ozone concentrations here. Not unique.
Zach, may I jump in and ask a question that others might be thinking of as well?
Yeah.
And forgive me for interrupting, but this just dawned on me that why wouldn't we all then say, those unsophisticated like me, we're doing our darn best, but because of that darn lake, we can never be out of that category of.
Yeah.
Was that just such?
No, Kevin. Yeah, Mayor Burns, it's a great insight. There are a few things that I'm going to present today that make it seem like there's nothing that you can do despite your best efforts because of either meteorological, physical characteristics of where the city's located. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about fire smoke. If smoke is coming in from Canada, well, you know, what are we supposed to do about that? This is not unique to Chicago. Houston has the same issue. New York City, coastal, Connecticut, New Haven has the same issue, where you've got these kind of, you know, big cities on, you know, at the land-water interface. You know, we see this issue with the lake shore or the marine shore dynamics that produce high air pollution. Obviously, we didn't plan on this, you know, 400 years ago or whatever, when Chicago was being established as a trading post and then a big city. But you know, that's the product of the setup that we have here in the Chicagoland area. We'll talk a little bit about what we might be able to do about this and think through what some solutions may be, given that we have this complex issue. But that's a really astute observation, Mayor Burns. I appreciate you making that.
Yeah, thanks for just not saying it has nothing to do with precipitation, Burns. That was a dumb answer. But thank you very much, Zach, for saving me on that one.
So precipitation is, you know, that's one of the primary ways that the atmosphere cleans out. Rain is a good thing. It cleans out smog. Last summer, I don't know if you all remember this, but it was one of the droughtiest and driest summers that we had. We didn't get rain coming in periodically. You know, even those like afternoon convective thunderstorms that we usually get in the summers here, you know, where it's hot all day and then it kind of breaks up late afternoon when we get a nice rain shower. It's really helpful for pollution. We didn't get a lot of that last summer, and it had significant impacts on our ozone concentration. You see this big jump in 2023. Some of that had to do with the wildfire smoke, but a lot of it had to do with the drought and the fact that we didn't get much rain last year. So talking about now is ozone. Now we're talking about particulate matter. PM is all the rage right now. It's what everybody's talking about, because we got a new PM 2.5 standard. There's a new National Ambient Air Quality Standard, or NAAQS, for PM, that just dropped February 7th, about a month ago. The previous annual standard for PM 2.5 was 12 micrograms per cubic meter. And based on health effects literature and other scientific information, US EPA felt that for, you know, the most protective level for public health was to change the standard from an annual average of 12 micrograms to 9 micrograms. That's a big change. If we look at this map on the right here, this is showing the map of the PM 2.5 monitors in the region with our estimated design value. Again, this is this 3-year average that we use to determine compliance with the NAAQS, with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Anything orange or red are values above this 9 micrograms standard, the new value. All of the Chicago monitors, actually most of the monitors in the state of Illinois are above the new standard. There have not been designations yet. We're going to talk a little bit about what the process will look like now that there's a new standard on a later slide. But this is, you know, we went from having no PM 2.5 non-attainment areas in all of Illinois to now potentially having most of the monitors in Illinois and all of the monitors in Chicago being non-attainment and not meeting the standard. If we look at the trends on the left here, also, you know, since the early 2000s, we've seen a significant decline in PM 2.5 concentrations. If you look back into the 70s, it looks even better. You know, we were kind of way up at here in the 70s and 80s, and then it really came down to pretty significantly low levels. A lot of this had to do, particularly the drop, you know, this drop in this period here, starting in 2012 down into here, had to do with the change of our electricity generating infrastructure from coal to natural gas. So burning coal is a primary source of nitrogen oxide emissions and also sulfur dioxide emissions. As our power fleet moved from coal to gas, the SO2 emissions, the sulfur dioxide emissions, the bottom dropped out. Our SO2 concentrations, our ambient SO2 concentrations are so low now that they're in many areas below the detection limit of our monitors that are out there. And so the change from coal to gas and the electricity generating fleet in the country has really been a huge benefit to air pollution. And we see it in PM 2.5 because SO2 is a main precursor to particulate pollution. And, you know, a lot of that coal generation was happening kind of downstate along the Ohio River Valley, but we did have some coal generation throughout the region and really saw, you know, an inflection point and kind of a dive in here as a lot of these coal plants either shut down or fuel switch. Last year, we saw this jump. In PM 2.5, this also had to do with 2023 being a bad fire year in this region. But the overall trend is a feel-good story. Particle pollution has really dropped pretty dramatically over the years. And we have a new standard at 9 micrograms. This is this bottom dashed line. You know, this blue line is the average of all monitors in the kind of Chicago, Indiana area. And you can see that on average, most of the monitors are above this new standard. And we have some monitors that are way above that standard. I'm just going to say one thing about air toxics. There is a tool called Air Tox Screen that some of you may be familiar with. You can get to it on EPA's website. It gives you very detailed information about air toxics information down at the census block level. You can really dig into sources in your communities. You know, this map is basically showing cancer risk in these kind of blue colors. It's showing the sources of air toxics in the circles. You can dig down into the demographics in the census block and really, you know, look at what the profile of air toxic emissions and sources and risk are in your communities. You may have become familiar with Air Tox Screen. It used to be called NATA, the National Air Toxics Assessment. This was the tool that, you know, some community members used to figure out the toxic issues and the sources related with ethylene oxide. It's an open source tool that anybody could go on and take a look at. There's a lot of great information here. Really lets you drill down into kind of pollution sources in your region. All right. The story of 2023. We saw it in the news. We experienced it as we walked around last summer. wildfire smoke. This is a map, a picture actually from space, taken from a satellite of smoke coming from fires in Quebec into Chicago. The smoke is very distinct from the clouds. The clouds are the white here and here, but you can see this kind of brown haze. This is wildfire smoke on June 27th, very clearly coming into this region, blanketing all of Lake Michigan and really hammering Chicago. We can look at monitoring data. This is showing an average of all of the monitors in the Chicago region of PM 2.5 monitors. Each color is a different year. And so if you take a daily average for each year, you can see I've got, I'm gonna bar over this, 2019 in red, 2020 in orange, 2023 is in blue. But basically you take an average of all the monitors for every day, plot it in a time series like this. Look at 2023, June. I mean, we had off the charts particulate matter pollution as a result of these fire events in 2023. You know, this is a very compelling story. 2023, it was not normal. This map is showing on the left temperature anomaly from the 30-year average, precipitation anomaly from the 30-year average. Warm colors represent that it was warmer than the 30-year average, cooler than the 30-year average in green. An interesting thing about these charts, these are auto-generated by the Midwest Regional Climate Center. Usually when things are kind of dancing around normal, the zero, if you look at the legend on the plot, the zero kind of will line up in the middle of the scale. Well, you can see here that for the precipitation anomaly, the warm colors represent it was dry in this May through June period. It was extremely dry. Zero is all the way over here on the right, where usually, you know, because they had to push the scale so far to show how dry it really was. Similar with the temperature anomaly. You know, the zero is over here to the left, showing that they needed to really bump the high end, the higher temperatures. So, you know, on the multi-decadal average, it was very dry and very warm last, you know, May, June, and we had all this fire smoke coming into the region. They were related, right? You know, when it's dry regionally, you tend to get more fires. It would have helped if we had some more rain during that period, because rain really does clean out the atmosphere and would have knocked some of that smoke down for us. But we had this kind of trifecta of smoke, hot temperatures, and dryness, no precipitation, that really ended up with creating historic air quality problems for us last year. So let me stop there before I get into the kind of regulatory issues. That was a little science tech heavy. Any questions before I move on?
Questions or comments from anyone? Curiosities? There's a couple comments in the chat.
We do have one question in the chat from Glenn, Gabriel.
Yeah.
So Glenn, you can come off mute if you want to. Pretty straightforward. How do diesel emissions factor into PM 2.5?
Yeah, that's a great question. Diesel is both one of the biggest sources of nitrogen oxide emissions that we have, so NOx. And NOx is a precursor to PM. But then diesel particulates are a direct emission, like black carbon is what we call it from diesel. Is also elemental carbon is also a source of particulate emissions. Newer vehicles with functioning emissions control systems should have particle traps, filters that knock a lot of the particulate matter down from diesel. Similarly, there's emissions control systems that are basically like catalytic converters, catalysts that reduce NOx emissions as well. There'll be a slide about this, as we're finding, though, not all of our trucks, even the newer trucks, are operating functional emissions control systems. So if you have a fully functional newer vehicle, diesel vehicle, you're still going to get, you know, some NOx and PM emissions, not like the older vehicles. You know, the older trucks that are on the road are pretty significant contributors. And with Chicago being a hub of freight, you know, we have, you know, over a dozen intermodal yards. intermodal facilities, rail to truck, truck to ship. We have a lot of trucks coming into this region, freight handling equipment, rail, and these are all sources of diesel emissions. So it's not just the diesel trucks, but the rail sources as well can be quite dirty.
Zach, a follow-up question from Mavis Bates. How does PM 2.5 affect climate change, and does it relate to greenhouse gas? Greenhouse gases?
Good questions. So it's tricky with PM 2.5. Some particles. So when we think about climate change, we talk about like forcers. Is it a pollutant that's warming the climate? It's a positive forcer, or is it a pollutant that's cooling the climate, a negative forcer? Some particles, and sulfates are one in particular. This is a pollutant that comes from SO2 emissions that converts into the atmosphere into aerosol sulfate. It's a very strong negative forcer. So it actually reflects sunlight back out of the atmosphere and cools the atmosphere. So you may have heard that like volcanic emissions, if there's a huge volcanic kind of eruption, you can actually get a cooling of the atmosphere. That's because of the sulfate emissions. There are other particles that reflect the sunlight and amplify heat and don't let it kind of work in like a greenhouse gas effect. So one of the issues, this is where atmospheric science is interesting and crazy complex. I mentioned that with the conversion of coal to gas and this major improvement in air pollution that resulted from the reduction of SO2 emissions and sulfate from the coal burning power plants going away, lower sulfate in the atmosphere is actually counteracting. It's creating kind of a warmer atmosphere. Coal to gas also is not it's not great for climate on the other side, because the methane supply chain, the natural gas supply chain, we know releases a lot of greenhouse gases. So there's so many connections and interdependencies that we really try to factor in as we're considering different types of policy options. That's a great question.
That's it for questions.
Okay. So what does this all mean for us in terms of regulations? I've been talking about the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS. There's basically 6 what are called criteria pollutants. Ozone is one of these. PM 2.5 is one of these. These are regulations that produce essentially regulatory mandates that states need to meet. It requires that states control the emissions of the pollutants that are causing these NAAQS issues. The areas are determined as being in attainment of the NAAQS based on surface monitoring. So this is a map that shows the counties that are pulled into the current ozone standard, the ozone NAAQS. You can see the counties that are pulled in and the monitors that are around the region to determine whether we are meeting the NAAQS or not. We're not. But essentially, if you're a non-attainment area, then you need to have a plan called a state implementation plan to figure out how you're going to get your monitors into attainment of that standard by a certain date in the future. Chicago is currently a non-attainment area for ground level ozone. We have previously been a non-attainment area for both lead and particulate matter, but we're not anymore. Although there is a new particulate matter standard, as I just mentioned, that dropped in early February, that is going to create a PM 2.5 non-attainment area in Chicago. And so Chicago will be non-attainment for PM 2.5 coming up soon, and we're going to talk about what that means. So what does it mean when we're a non-attainment area for ozone? There are regulatory requirements that come into place. It's a progressive standard, meaning when an area is first designated as non-attainment, there are certain things that they have to do along the way towards making that area attainment. A lot of it has to do with how stationary sources are permitted, what types of sources can build, what types of controls those sources need, what size sources need to have types of controls. This is a whole permitting program. And as you as you move along in time and you get, you know, through different levels of non-attainment, from you know, you start as a marginal non-attainment area. If you don't attain the standard by a certain date, you know, 3 years out from your initial designation, then you're reclassified or bumped up from marginal to moderate. If you don't meet at the future date, a couple years down the road there, you go from moderate to serious, and then serious to severe. And with each level through time, the requirements, the regulatory requirements become more and more strict. And so with stationary sources, permitting becomes more and more difficult. The threshold above which stationary sources need to be permitted and have different types of controls gets lower and lower. Once you hit that, the serious non-attainment area level, which Chicago has been for previous standards, previous versions of the ozone standards, you have to have a vehicle inspection and maintenance program, an I&M program, you know, where we're having to take our cars every other year and to have a smog check. And the states also have to put in implementation plans with emissions control programs to reach attainment. So this is the plan. These are the types of sources and control programs that we're going to be putting in as a state to meet the standard. Chicago is going to be bumped up from a moderate to a serious non-attainment area for the current ozone standard in August 2024, later this year. We have been a serious non-attainment area for a previous version of the ozone standard, so all of the requirements are already in place. So from a practical standpoint, there's likely not going to be a huge change as a result of this bump up. It's going to sort of prolong the requirements and needing to have some of these requirements in place, vehicle inspection and maintenance, major source permitting threshold at 50 tons per year. There's a kind of a litany of requirements that are in place to limit emissions, trying to get this area into attainment. So the good thing is that there probably aren't going to be any new regulatory requirements. The bad thing is that even though we've had these requirements in place now for many years, if you remember that trend plot, the ozone concentrations have leveled off. They're not continuing to go down. So these requirements under the Clean Air Act have maybe reached a point where, they have reached a point where they're not producing new progress in ozone. You know, why? Their stationary sources are already pretty well controlled. Most of our light duty fleet of vehicles, you know, so the smaller vehicles are quite clean. We don't have great controls on, you know, somebody mentioned diesel trucks, diesel emissions. There are a lot, indications are that we have a fairly dirty diesel fleet out there, or there are other reasons why the diesel emissions are higher than they should be. Warmer temperatures, as we have warmer summers, you know, we see every year, the warmest year on record, you know, this is going to produce higher ozone concentration. So we're kind of running up against the limits of what these regulatory programs that were designed in the 70s really can do.
Zach, I'm going to ask you a question that you can wait for later if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Comment you just shared that we are bumping up against what it is we can do regulatory wise. The average citizen like myself might ask the question, then what the heck do we do? And that's a hell of a question. So
No, and we're going to talk through this. I hope we get to talk through this, you know, at the end of this call here.
Okay, good.
Maybe in the next, I'll get there in the next 30 or 40 minutes.
No problem. Thank you.
We need to think about other sources, basically, is what it comes down to. The stationary sources have been, you know, the stack, the power plants, the industrial sources have been the primary lever around which we've achieved pretty significant reduction. Vehicle technology has also improved. So our cars and trucks, the light duty cars and trucks are very, very clean. And there are other sources that our regulatory programs haven't touched very well. We mentioned diesel and freight handling equipment. Buildings are a big source of NOx. You know, heating and fuel use in buildings are a big source of emissions as well. So, you know, I think we need to start thinking about like, what does the next generation of emissions control programs look like, given that there's not a, you know, there's still some wiggle room with stationary sources. I'll show a slide on this, but you know, it's evolving our thinking to other types of sources essentially.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So PM 2.5 next. This is all that we're talking about right now at LADCO with our states for the most part, because we just have this new standard that came into place, you know, last month. The standard went from 12 to 9 micrograms per cubic meter. This is weighted 3-year average. You know, most of the monitors in Illinois are potentially violating. The process is that first, EPA has to designate non-attainment areas based on monitoring data. And we know that EPA is going to make this designation based on monitoring data from the years 2022 to 2024. EPA proposes, so first states make recommendations to EPA, and the state recommendations will have to go in February 2025. And basically Illinois EPA will say, you know, hey, US EPA, this is what we think the boundaries should look like for the non-attainment areas in our state. Looking at all the monitors, you know, what they're measuring and kind of what the areas of influence are for those monitors, where the sources are. EPA will consider that, and then EPA will make final designations a year later in February 2026. So I mentioned 2023 was a very bad air quality year in this region. We had a lot of fire smoke. Meteorologically, it was historic. It was dry and hot. Impacted 2020. You know, will impact that 3-year 2020 to 2022 to 2024 average. So if the mandate is that states are required to control emissions to mitigate air pollution, bring the monitors in their state boundaries down to meet the standard, what does the state do when the emissions are from an uncontrollable source like a wildfire? You know, this is one day, we're looking at a map of smoke overhead seen from a satellite. It's like a digitized picture. We had some fires up in Quebec, and look at the monitors down here in Chicago. The red and dark red are like over the top concentrations. We had, you know, air pollution concentrations in late June that were on par, the worst in the world, actually, is what the media was saying on those days. We had the highest air pollution in the world on those days as a result of the fires. What is a state to do? What are the regulators supposed to do when they have impacts from a source that are outside of their regulatory jurisdiction? That's not rhetorical, that's a question. Does anybody have any ideas?
Well, what they did do is they decided to ignore it, right? Which doesn't seem like a good idea. It's like it's got to be taken. We're going to have to reduce more from other sources to account for it.
Yeah, you could think about trying to make up the difference by reducing other sources, definitely.
Zach, phrase that question again.
Are there any regulatory tools or regulatory levers that a state has to avoid their regulatory commitments under the Clean Air Act if the air pollution that state is experiencing is coming from a source outside of their jurisdiction?
It's the good neighbor law, is it not?
There's good neighbor. That is one. That's a great one, Mayor Burns. Yep. So
oh, thank God! I finally redeemed myself. This is good.
you can point fingers at the state upwind, exactly. And we're going to talk a little bit about good neighbor. Exceptional events. Does this term ring a bell to anyone? Have you heard this?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's this exceptional events rule. You know, in 2007, EPA kind of codified about 30 years of guidance and discussion around this, which basically allows an air agency to say, if there exists a clear and causal relationship to the monitored violation, you know, this monitor was exceeding the national ambient air quality standards because of something exceptional, a fire, a volcano, something like that. The event was not reasonably controllable or preventable by the air agency. This fire was in forest in Quebec. It was not reasonably controllable by Illinois. And the event was caused by human activity or the event's caused by human activity that's unlikely to recur at a particular location, or it was a natural event. Natural event is a wildfire. So what a state can do is appeal to US EPA and say, hey, let's think in the context of the PM 2.5 designation. When we're calculating the concentrations, the design values that you're going to use to designate whether this area is going to be attainment or non-attainment, let's ignore those days that were heavily impacted by fire smoke, because we know that there was nothing we could have done about this. So you actually recalculate the average, you calculate the design value, removing the days that had fire smoke concentration. If you remember back at this chart here, you take this number out, these couple numbers out, the average for 2023 looks a lot different, right? I mean, this is pretty clear. You take out some spikes and the average changes pretty dramatically. So that's kind of the essence of how an exceptional events demonstration could play out for the PM 2.5 standard. And a lot of the work that we're doing now at LADCO is working with our states to figure out what that would look like. Any questions about exceptional events? The media really picked up exceptional events last summer as well. There was a lot of kind of writing about what the exceptional events rule actually means for regulators and whether it's some sort of loophole or a legitimate tool. And we haven't heard the end of exceptional events.
Well, Zach, I'm going to ask this question that others perhaps are thinking about. You mentioned earlier we live in the hub of transportation nationwide. Yeah. Are we not therefore then in an exceptional event zone, considering all the railroad crossings and all the materials that railroads carry, put on trucks, etc.? The fact of the matter is, one disaster causes us to be in an exceptional event situation.
It's not an exceptional. So it's not an exceptional situation by the definition of how this exceptional events rule was.
Okay, so East Palestine, for example.
This was really like, here's the picture of like what people were thinking about when they were thinking about exceptional events, right? Dust storms, mud fires, volcanoes. There are regulatory levers that we could consider with the freight handling in this region. And I think this is where we need to start to figure out collectively how to come together around reducing emissions from freight, modernizing the freight handling in this region. I mean, it's a key part of our economy, a lot of jobs, there's all the economic benefits. And, I think there are a lot of opportunities for modernizing the infrastructure. It's going to take capital. There's some capital coming down from the Fed right now in various places. And really, I think this is where we need to think about how to make, the economic driver of this region in freight coincide with our air pollution issues that we're having partially as a result of it.
Zach, we've got two questions. One in the chat, and then Kyra just raised her hand. So Sam Bingham, who's our Clean Cities coordinator in Chicago, has a good question. Sam, if you want to speak up, otherwise I'll read for you.
Yeah, Zach, you keep talking about the existing monitoring network for 2.5, PM 2.5 in Illinois. Will the new standard require IEPA to put out more monitors, since it seems like a lot of these areas in the state with monitors are showing non-attainment? But does that mean that, well, they're only showing non-attainment because there's no one monitoring the air quality in other areas of the state?
Right. Yeah. No data, no problem, right?
Right.
So there's every 5 years, the state regulatory agencies have to do a network assessment. The next one is due summer 2025, and LADCO helps with that, and so we're starting to work at that now. The context for this next 5-year monitoring network assessment is we have this new PM 2.5 standard, right? Also, this EPA Administrator Reagan has leaned heavily in on environmental justice issues. So do we need to think about, you know, changing the monitoring network for PM 2.5? Is the existing network sufficient? Do we also need to consider whether the monitoring network is sufficient for measuring disproportionate impacts? I don't know the answers to those questions. We are asking those questions to EPA now. We do know that there's money coming out of the Fed through the Inflation Reduction Act for states to buy monitors and to place new monitors. You know, part of the process of this 5-year network assessment is to try to determine that there's no redundancy in the network. Like you don't have, you know, you're not spending resources on 2 monitors that are kind of measuring the same thing, but also to make sure that there aren't any gaps in the network. We haven't looked that closely at PM 2.5 in a couple of cycles because we haven't had PM 2.5 non-attainment areas in a couple 5-year cycles because we haven't had PM 2.5 non-attainment areas in this region. That's going to be playing out over the course of the next year. And I can't really forecast where it's going to land, but that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kyra, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions, Sam, and thanks so much for your time, Zach. Thinking about that focus on environmental justice and particularly how you know, in so many of our communities, some of those industries that create some of these more toxic sources are concentrated. I did kind of want to know more about how cities can still maybe even activate certain policies or create policies so that even on average, if we are in attainment at large, we can still meet the needs of our communities that aren't in those attainment boundaries, but wouldn't necessarily trigger, you know, a designation at large. And I kind of wanted to get your insights on that, and perhaps in your answer, if you want to tie it even to this exceptional event rule, I think the question kind of applies to that as well, because as I understand the rule, it would just mute the data from that exceptional event so that that average is lowered, but the impact on communities is still the same, whether the volcano exploded, whether the data is there or not. So trying to think about the ultimate outcome and the benefit of these policies is improved lives, right?
Yeah. So let me try to parse that question. So the first part you asked about what states or regulators could do if there's not a non-attainment area, but there are still concentrations of sources and impacts, right? You know, I think that's a question for the larger group. I can say that there's like legal frameworks that regulators have to fall back on, you know, and so there would have to be some statutory foundation. There would have to be rulemaking for the regulator to do something. Otherwise, they're setting themselves up to get sued. And so there's that. You know, I hear a lot of talk about trying to mitigate litigation risk, and regulators across the country, and wondering where the legal authority lands for some of kind of these you know, newer issues, like some of the environmental justice issues that the CPA is pushing. Where's the statutory authority is what some of the regulators have been asking. Can you just point to the Clean Air Act or Title VI? And there's a lot of, this is working its way through the courts, and there's conversations by, you know, state regulators, local regulators, and EPA trying to really establish that statutory framework. So I can say that about your first part of the question. I think I would like to hear, and I have a slide to maybe open up discussion about this later in this presentation as well. The part about exceptional events and the fact that, you know, the breathers are still being impacted by the pollution regardless of where it came from. It's a legitimate point. You know, we had one summer of bad smoke here last year. We'll see some smoke coming through this region periodically, usually not like last summer. You know, but if you live in like Boise or some of the communities out west, you know, they're experiencing fire smoke like we had last summer every year, or every other year. And to them, for the regulator to say, hey, well, we're just going to ignore, these days, and, actually things on average look quite good. Well, we're still having to deal with, terrible fire smoke every year. What are we going to do about it? That's a big question, because when it comes to wildfires, it's really not in a state regulator's jurisdiction. Do you start to point fingers at the U.S. Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, what we call the federal land managers who have jurisdiction over managing forested land? A lot of people would argue, yes. Like, well, what are they doing to keep these fires from being catastrophic? So I think that the exceptional events rule is a legitimate tool in our air pollution management toolbox. It can't be abused, obviously, but there has to be recognition that there are certain sources that the state regulators who have mandates can't control with their mandates. So they do what they can with the sources that they have regulatory jurisdiction over. And, we think of a different regulatory framework or tool to think about fires, is my opinion on this.
Got it. Thank you. Oh, really quickly,
Yeah.
is the exceptional rule something that's like given within a year's time of the event, within a day of an event? Do you know that time scale?
There is a statute. There are statutes of limitations. States don't act like within a day. It's usually like months after. So if we take the PM 2.5 designations, here, perfect. Thanks for the segue to my next slide. Promulgation happened last month. A year from that, the states will need to make their designation recommendations to EPA, saying these are the areas that we think, based on our monitoring data, could be designated as non-attainment for PM 2.5. On that same day, the states can also submit their exceptional events demonstrations that say our designations recommendations are based on excluding some of these days from the design values. And the exceptional events demonstration is a document that makes that case. This is the clear and causal evidence for why we should exclude June 28th, because the 5-year, it was a really high day. So the states basically have, these fires happen in summer 2023. They will have 18 months or something, a year and a half after that to put these demonstrations in. That's the end. That's like the drop dead end date. The states, I think, are planning to try to get some of these demonstrations in towards the end of this year. So the timing kind of varies depending on whether it's ozone or PM 2.5. There's some like minutia in there about details about regulatory significance. You can only do one of these demonstrations if there's a regulatory significant outcome. You can't just say, hey, we have a monitor in Peoria. It was impacted by fire smoke. But Peoria doesn't have any type of air pollution NAAQS problem. The EPA would ignore that argument. It's not worth putting resources into it. So there's this regulatory significance component to the demonstrations that the states also have to make in their argument.
That was very helpful. That was helpful.
Okay.
Thanks.
I can't see the chat. Let's see.
Just one comment, Zach, on the inclusion of Canada in the maps and policies. Just a comment. Climate doesn't stop at the Upper Peninsula.
Of course, yeah. So this is kind of the map of what the new PM 2.5 NAAQS planning timeline is going to look like. A lot happening in the next couple of years. We've got the final designations from EPA will happen in 2 years, February 2026. Between now and then, there's going to be a lot of considerations about fire impacts, smoke impacts, what are the average values that go into making the designations. These 120-day letters from EPA is basically where the states make their designation recommendations. What is it? 8 months later, EPA comes back and says 120 days before the final designation, this is what we're going to do. EPA is basically giving the states one last bite at the apple. The states can then respond and say, well, you EPA, adjusted our recommendations in this way. We think you should reconsider your recommendations, your designations, and take these other things into consideration. And then the final designations will drop February 2026. These timelines are all prescribed in the Clean Air Act. There'll be an analysis of transport, how an ISIP is an infrastructure SIP, how is transport. There was a mention of good neighbor SIPs and good neighbor plans. How are upwind states impacting PM 2.5? This doesn't have to do with wildfires. This more has to do with like controllable human-based sources upwind. There will be some transport analysis that'll be due a year after that. And then the non-attainment area state implementation plans will be due in August 2027. And basically these plans will codify what IEPA's plans are going to be for getting the state into attainment, including emissions control programs by the attainment date in 2032. So it's a long kind of runway to attainment, but there's a lot of process along that run. And I hope we have some other opportunities to engage along with this group in that process, so I can keep you updated on where things go there. All right, I just mentioned good neighbor. We talked about transport. This is another regulatory tool for understanding kind of upwind, downwind relationships. One of the things that we do at LADCO is we do modeling that allows us to quantify how much emissions from an upwind source contribute to air pollution problems downwind. We can do these really cool modeling exercises where we essentially put tracers in our models to say, this is where the pollution from this source or this area is landing. This is a picture of ozone tracers for sources in Texas and Louisiana. We have ozone impact. The ozone in Chicago is not just generated from sources in Chicago. It comes all the way up from the Gulf Coast. Depending on the flow patterns and kind of the meteorology that's happening, we do get a non-negligible amount of emissions and non-negligible amount of ozone being transported in from anthropogenic sources outside of our region. A lot of power generation, a lot of oil and gas down in the Gulf Coast, Texas area, and we can see that these sources impact our region. So if you then think about how you can use this tool, and you can then quantify at different monitors in the region, where's the pollution coming from? I mentioned that LADCO was formed partially as a result of litigation involving Wisconsin and Michigan appealing to Illinois and Indiana to help them with their air pollution problems. Well, how do we know that the air pollution in Sheboygan, Wisconsin is coming from Chicago? One of the reasons is these modeling tracer exercises that we do. In this case, we're looking at results, looking at the monitor at Zion, Illinois. So up in Illinois Dune State Park, we have a monitor, an air pollution monitor that measures ozone. It monitors very high ozone normally. And so when we put tracers in for emission sources in different parts of the region, we can find out that most of the ozone at Zion, Illinois is coming from sources in the Chicago metro suburbs area. So basically like the greater Chicagoland area, sources are coming into and contributing to ozone at Zion. That's the primary source of Zion smog. Secondary source, northern Indiana. So you can see this is basically Lake and Porter counties. So emissions from all that industry in Lake and Porter counties are kind of the secondary anthropogenic source that's contributing to Zion. We've tagged some other areas. Texas and Louisiana is in here. You kind of see these gray areas outside of our region, but really the ones that we are focusing on are these sources here. Shouldn't be surprising that Zion is mostly impacted by emissions from Chicago. Chicago's a big urban area. We can also look at other areas. So let's look at Muskegon, Michigan. Jump to the other side of the lake. Where's most of the ozone in Muskegon, Michigan coming from? Same place, Chicago metro suburbs. The scale is different on the y-axis. So the ozone concentrations aren't as high in Muskegon, but if you toggle back and forth between Zion And Muskegon, you're kind of seeing impacts from the same sources, Chicago and Northwest Indiana. We're pulling in Southeast Wisconsin here. This is basically Milwaukee. So we're getting some emissions from Milwaukee blowing across the lake and hitting Muskegon. But this type of analysis is the foundation of what we call a good neighbor state implementation plan, or a good neighbor analysis. To be a good neighbor to your state's downwind, you're actually required by the Clean Air Act to put emissions control programs in to lower the contribution of your sources, your in-state sources, to downwind air pollution problems. In addition to tagging things by states, we can also tag things by sectors. So the emissions coming to Zion from Chicago, where are they coming from in Chicago? On-road diesel and on-road non-diesel sources. So on-road gas is the largest source of the ozone precursor pollution in Zion. And on-road diesel is second. And then you start to look at some other sources. Off-road diesel, this is like, off-road or, forklifts and freight handling equipment and construction equipment, vehicles that operate off of roads, electricity generating, non-electricity generating points. So we still have some stationary source impacts. But this type, again, of analysis is really what we use to then start to figure out what an effective emissions control program should look like. If you want to reduce ozone in Muskegon, Sheboygan, Zion, these downwind transport regions, we should be looking at mobile sources, on-road and off-road sources. In Chicago, I can almost guarantee that this non-EGU point signal, this industrial point signal, is coming from sources in Northwest Indiana, because that's where we have, most of the heavy industry. So then if we start to think about, well, what are these industrial point sources in Chicago and Indiana? What types of sources are they? Municipal waste combustion, iron and steel. This is basically where we see there could be some potential reduction. So sources that are under controlled. Where can we get NOx reductions from these different types of sources if these sources were to put more control technology on? So these are for sources that are either under controlled or not controlled at all, industrial sources. Glass manufacturing, cement. Mark Jansen, can you tell me what's in engines? What types of engines are these?
So these are like engines that drive processes at factories. So if you're spinning a large mixer that's a diesel engine that spins that mixer, those are the kind of engines you're going to have to do that. So sort of any industrial engine that is burning, probably most likely natural gas, just to spin some industrial process.
Okay. So this is how we think about and parse emissions information here at LADCO. We use it to understand what the sources of emissions are, what the impacts of different emission sources are. And then once we understand, what sources are being, which are the impactful sources, are there emissions controls that are available to actually do something about those? So to wrap things up on the kind of statutory, regulatory, issues that we're dealing with. For ozone, we have this moderate non-attainment date coming up this year. It's going to be based on monitoring over the last 3 years, because 2023 was the last complete monitoring year. 2024 attainment date looks at the last complete monitoring year. So that will determine whether Chicago is going to be bumped up or not. Chicago is going to be bumped up, because we can already look at the design values for these 3 years and see that we're not meeting the standard. So Chicago is going to be bumped up from a moderate to a serious non-attainment date early next year. This is the serious bump up. So the attainment date is in August, and then like 6 months later or so, EPA will have a regulatory action where they actually bump up the area. And with that comes these additional regulatory requirements. I mentioned many of these are already in place. There's this ozone and PM NAAQS review, which happens every 5 years. I don't think they're going to relook at the PM NAAQS because they just changed the annual standard. But every 5 years, EPA looks at the National Ambient Air Quality Standards to determine if they're protective of public health. We talked about PM designations already. The final designations will happen in February 2026. We've got the serious non-attainment area attainment date in August 2027. So after Chicago's bumped up, it needs to then attain the standard by August 2027. And those are going to be based on data starting this year. 2024, 25, and 26 will go into determining attainment for that next ozone attainment date. We haven't talked about regional haze. This is like a welfare standard or an aesthetic standard. Has to do with how hazy things are in our pristine areas, like our national parks and national scenic areas, wilderness areas. And then we have an attainment date, not attainment data, an attainment date coming in 2032 for the PM NAAQS. This was a whirlwind tour of the regulatory issues that we're facing in Chicago and what some of the timing is that we're dealing with. Let me stop there to see if there are any questions.
Zach, just a time check. So we're at 11:19. We need to.
Yeah.
So
I see that.
Okay. Nope, we're good to. I think we're good to proceed. Again, a gentle comment in there, but we'll come back to the comment on indoor air quality if we get through everything else.
Okay. So I'm going to jump quickly through these emission slides because I want to have more of an open discussion about kind of what we can do. So, you know, we look at inventories. Like Mark has spent his career developing inventories of emission sources. We have incredible granularity around the types of emissions that we inventory, and we account for as many of the sources of pollution as we can, from cans of hairspray all the way up to giant electricity generating units and everything in between. And really, these inventories are the foundation of all of our air quality planning and decision support work. And this is a lot of the support that we've been doing with Edith and her group at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, is helping understand kind of what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, what are the co-benefits of reducing those greenhouse gas emissions with reducing air pollution emissions. You know, and this is really a fundamental piece, a fundamental component of air quality planning is around emissions. You have to know what the sources of pollution are to start to formulate solutions. We looked at trends in air pollution concentrations based on ambient monitoring. These are trends in the last 20 years of NOx emissions. So you can see NOx emissions have gone down. This is just in the state of Illinois. Nice reduction in NOx emissions. We can see where those reductions are coming from. Dark blue, mostly from on-road mobile vehicles. We've also gotten a nice reduction in the gray bars, which is from electricity generating units, power plants. Some sectors haven't changed a ton, you know, so non-road sources of NOx have gone down a bit, but not quite as much as on-road. Non-EG point, those industrial point sources, they've declined a little bit, but not a whole lot. So this indicates that there are a couple of sectors that we could still potentially control. If you look at 2022, non-road sources of NOx, non-road mobile sources of NOx, again, freight handling equipment, construction and mining equipment, and the state of Illinois are a bigger source of NOx than on-road mobile sources are. So what do we do with that information? You can look at volatile organic compounds. Again, remember, this is a pollutant that's a precursor to ozone. It's a precursor to PM 2.5. It's also a source of air toxics. The reductions haven't been as, you know, at the same rate that we saw with mobile sources. Most of the reductions have come again from on-road sources, so more fuel efficient vehicles using less gasoline, you know, less emissions from gasoline. Gotten a pretty good reduction from on-road mobile sources here. Some sources, you know, the kind of single largest source now, solvents, has actually gone up in the last 20 years. You know, solvents, there's a lot of sources of solvents, surface coatings, industrial solvents. Personal care products are surprisingly a fairly large hairspray, fairly large source of VOC emissions. This is based on monitoring data. And those emissions haven't changed much, or if they've gone up in time. We can also look at pollution from space and help this to understand where our emission sources are. This is a picture of NO2 from a satellite called Tropomi. And we can see the different areas of Chicago where we have high NO2 emissions. We've got this kind of O'Hare, and there's a lot of warehousing up north of O'Hare, and we see a kind of high concentration of NO2 there. We can kind of see the rail, the intermodal facilities. We can also see areas of heavy industry, Joliet and Gary, and kind of south of Chicago as well. And these types of images help us understand where those sources are and whether our inventories are actually telling us the right story. Freight in Chicago, truck emissions. Somebody raised the issue of diesel. So there's this issue with diesel emissions that nobody's quite sure what to do about. There's a couple of them. One of them has to do with tuners or defeat devices. There's a lot of information and data now that indicates that about a third of diesel trucks, and this goes all the way from light duty, medium, heavy duty, all types of diesel trucks, from the light duty diesel truck that your neighbor or you may be driving, all the way up to the big long haul heavy duty, have some sort of a tuner or a defeat device to bypass the pollution control system. Why do people use tuners on their diesel trucks? They get more horsepower and improved fuel economy. If you're a heavy duty trucker and you're driving 80 to 100,000 miles a year, a couple miles per gallon is a lot of money. But what do? They increase the NOx emissions. Basically, they're overriding the emissions control system. And the NOx emissions increase by 20 to 100 times when you're running one of these tuners. This is a problem because, we've seen that, we need NOx reductions if we're going to meet attainment of the NAAQS. But if a third of our trucks are operating these tuners, it's a significant issue in producing a lot more emissions than we need to be out there. The tricky part of this is who has jurisdiction to do something about it. How do you find this, and what do you do about it? The tactic so far has been trying to find the shops that install the tuners and the retailers that sell the tuners, but not doing enforcement on the people who are driving the vehicles. Another issue with diesel is idling. When trucks idle for a long time, greater than 30 minutes, their emissions control systems cool down, their catalytic converters cool down, and basically they become ineffective, and they are essentially producing, again, dozens of times higher emissions than when the engines are warm. When we have inefficient intermodal facilities, if there's a lot of queuing of trucks and idling, you're getting these inefficient and underperforming emissions control systems. We're doing a lot of work to really try to figure out what the extent of this problem is. This map is basically showing Chicago. It's showing different types of land use. So you could see warehousing is the blue. And you can see in the pink squares, this is the residence time of where trucks are idling. So we got telemetry data from CMAP and from data from onboard systems on the trucks to understand where the trucks were moving around in Chicago, and we could figure out where the trucks were sitting. We can figure out from the telemetry data when they're moving and where they're moving. We can also figure out when they're operating and just sitting there. And so the red squares indicate where there's a lot of idling happening. Not surprisingly, a lot of idling is happening around intermodal facilities and warehouses. So this is where the trucks are sitting and idling. This data basically shows us that, if there are also communities, schools, homes around these intermodal facilities or warehouse facilities, they're also being subject to very high diesel emissions. So with all of this data, it all comes together around air pollution management, decision support based on empirical information, evidence-based decision making. So what can we do? What can a region, state, city do to attain the NAAQS? Let me stop there and see if we can kind of have a discussion around what is the conventional way that states or municipalities have typically tried to attain the national ambient air quality standards? Like, what are the regulatory tools that states use?
So go ahead and speak up or just raise your hand. We are going to run if you just let Zach and Mark go a few minutes long because this is fascinating. Please leave if you must. So we have a comment just about private cars are subject to emission testing while most trucks are not.
Yeah, I&M, great one. Yeah. There's some debate about how effective I&M is, but it certainly pushes older, dirty vehicles off the road. Enforceable emissions control measures. Yeah.
We had an interesting question about the solvents. I have to say that one sort of tickled me or terrified me too. So Kate from Brookfield was looking for more granular information on solvents and an effective way to reduce them. So do you have a map similar, I guess, Kate, was this what you're looking for, to the solvent emissions? I think the hairspray's all around us. That's, again, terrifying, but.
Yeah, they're kind of related to like population density, and what the states have done is they've implemented like low VOC formulation, like formulation rules of the types of surface coatings, for example, that can be sold. You've seen this when you go into like Home Depot and you go to buy paint. You can buy low VOC paint or zero VOC paint. I don't think you can get full VOC paint. I don't even think that's a thing anymore. So they've set formulation limits on the types, on the amount of VOC that can be associated or can be in these formulations. But some of these other things, personal care products, are it's really tricky to figure out how to control those things, particularly because some of the pollutants. You take formaldehyde as an example. Formaldehyde is in everything, and or everything breaks down to formaldehyde. It's a toxic, it's very reactive for ozone, it's a precursor to PM. I can say there's a decent amount of work trying to figure out what to do about formaldehyde and the class of compounds that are most likely to become formaldehyde. But they are a large source. Solvents are our single biggest source of anthropogenic VOCs. States also look at kind of federal fuel economy standards, leaning on the Fed to do some things. And then there's like the voluntary programs. How do we reduce emissions from non-enforceable but voluntary programs, like getting people to shift modes, use public transit, incentivize people to maybe electrify their vehicles or their lawn and garden equipment. So there are some regulatory tools out there that we can rely on, both enforceable and voluntary, that can really make a huge difference. So I know we're at the top of the hour, or the top of the end of the talk here. I have some slides here that will be circulated to you that show some examples of different types of policies and how we think about policies. These align pretty closely with some of the Climate Pollution Reduction Act work that Edith has done at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Lawn and garden equipment, ICI boilers, diesel vehicles, public fleets, electrifying different parts of transportation, with ideas on different types of policy options that could be used to go after these different sources and different types of sources. And then let me just say about environmental justice. We all know the data are clear. Low-income communities of color are overburdened by pollution. They live where the sources are, and or they're in places where they're downwind of the big sources. These areas are associated with structural problems with zoning, development funding. The solutions need to be not just permitting related, but zoning related. Thinking about, how zoning can be used to shift the locations of sources and the locations of communities as well. Still trying to figure out this policy tool question. There's a lot of grappling with the legal authority. And this is playing out as we speak, kind of in the courts and within the regulatory kind of agencies. We are data rich. We have a lot of information to inform these conversations. So I think, my ideas are working across the region through coalitions around emissions reduction programs, just like the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, bringing in Illinois EPA, to identify priorities and really digging into understanding how zoning and permitting authorities really need to coordinate to address injustices. And then I think collectively thinking about policy and enforcement frameworks that will work to address the injustices and the inequities that we know exist in air pollution sources and exposure. Sorry for running a bit long. I'm willing to hang out if people want to chat.
I'd like to keep chatting. We still have 30 people on the line. So if, again, if people need to go, if you have questions, this is a really good time to talk with Zach. Zach, I'm wondering if we couldn't go back a couple of slides to some of the sources that you've identified. And if you could talk about, I guess, how you and I got to working on the landscape emissions because of the work you had done on some of these priority areas. So I'm, what I'd love the question to be would be, what are the 3 top things that we could do? And I don't think we'll get that far, but just give us some examples of the kinds of regulation or education that local governments can do.
Yeah. So I think it boils down to this. I've talked about NOx and VOCs. There's different sources of ozone, PM, and air toxics, but NOx and VOCs are coincident across all of them. So if we're going to try to think about co-benefits, getting the most bang for the buck, NOx and VOCs really seem to be the 2 classes of pollutants that we should be going after. NOx also is, because it's combustion related, will have a greenhouse impact. So the same sources, if you're reducing NOx, you're also going to reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. So when we're thinking about control strategies and control programs to identify NOx and VOC emissions reductions, we think about feasibility. Does a control technology exist, or is there an alternative to the current source type that would reduce the emissions from that source? Are the controls cost effective? Are you going to get, when you're thinking about dollars per tons of emissions reduced, we can quantify this. So we have this information. So we want to look for controls that are cost effective. Whose jurisdiction is it? Like, is this within a state or municipal agency's regulatory jurisdiction? Fuel economies of automobiles is not, this is federal, but there are things, for example, for automobiles that states and municipalities could potentially do. Think about anti-idling programs, electrifying public fleets, or, identifying dirty vehicles, getting them off the road. Is the policy going to be politically and publicly acceptable? Nobody wants to be the spokesperson out there saying, hey, we're coming to take your whatever it is, gas stove. There's the court of public opinion that we need to consider when we're thinking about emissions control options. There's a messaging component to that. I think you can get around some of those concerns, but it's something that needs to be considered. And then from a regulatory standpoint, there's this permanent and enforceable thing. So when a state puts in a plan to reduce, their NAAQS, their National Ambient Air Quality Standards issue, they need to show to EPA that the controls that they're putting in place are permanent and enforceable, meaning the state can enforce those reductions and they're not going to go away when, at some point in the future. I think there are voluntary programs, though, that aren't permanent and enforceable that are also worth thinking about. And so if we take these into consideration and then we start to think about what are the controls that will really have an impact. And these are the priority source categories that we've come up with looking across all of the different types of sources. We think there's a lot of opportunity in cleaning up public fleets, buses and refuse trucks, going to either clean diesel or electric as soon as possible. Turning over the light duty non-commercial, non-public fleet is going to be hard because, you're going to have to incentivize people, us, like the average person, the average driver to, buy cleaner vehicles. For the most part, clean vehicles are being marketed, but we're starting to see a backlash now in electrification of light duty vehicles. But, municipal and state planners do have some impacts over the public fleets. Short haul diesel vehicles. So we do know that when long haul trucks age out, they're often put into service doing short haul work, driving shorter distances. Or even if they're newer short haul diesel vehicles, these are things like box trucks or last mile delivery trucks, right? Like the trucks that are jumping from the warehouses to our doorstep, or from the warehouses to the refrigerator, to the supermarkets, box stores, whatever. These could be electrified actually pretty reasonably because, they're not driving 100,000 miles a year and they have duty cycles that would work as electric vehicles. And they're high emissions because they tend to be driving slower and idling a lot. So again, their emissions control systems are not being allowed to really work. Industrial, commercial, institutional boilers, identifying where we have dirty boilers, if they're not running natural gas, what types of kind of technology changeouts can be made and efficiency improvements and energy reduction strategies for ICI boilers. Lawn and garden equipment is something that we've looked at LADCO for a long time because we think it's a very feasible source to go after. This is getting people to, Edith has proposed a buyback program. So buying people's old, dirty gasoline lawnmowers, changing them with electric lawnmowers. This is like a voluntary incentive-based program, but can have a big impact on VOC emissions in particular. Off-road equipment, like construction equipment, switching engines, we know are particularly dirty. These are the rail engines that are kind of moving and reconfiguring cars for the long haul trains at rail yards. They are quite dirty, and we know that there's some opportunity there for improving emissions there. Volatile chemical products. We talked about this a little bit. Low VOC formulations, and really it's shifting the market because you can't really regulate use as much as you can regulate kind of the sale of different types of products. And then we got to figure out something about this diesel emissions control system defeat devices. Is this like a diesel I&M program? Is this, like really punitive, like ticketing for operators who are using these things? Like nobody has really come up with a great solution for how to solve this diesel emissions control defeat device problem, but we need to figure it out because it is a big deal. So that kind of summarizes, Edith, these other slides where I kind of get into like some other details about what different policies could be considered for these different types of sources. I hope that answered your question.
It did, and of course, there's much more that we can talk about in the solutions. And Jason's got a question. I guess if you just want to close out with that. So in addition to these reduction strategies that take time, are there actions we can take in the interim to reduce public health risk and impact?
Sorry, I talked for so long, my Bluetooth thing died. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So did you hear the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think messaging, we need to think first about like really acute pollution events. So if we have fire impacts like we had last summer, it's making sure that we're getting messaging out to our constituents and to our neighbors about what they should be doing, limiting, particularly people who have more vulnerable either respiratory or immune systems, like the very young, the very old, people who are immunocompromised, limiting exposure, so staying indoors, running air filters. Indoor air filters are really effective. So making sure that you've got good HEPA filters and you're changing those filters every per the specs of the device. In the non-acute pollution events, like so when we're just having some summertime, having some summertime ozone episodes where you're still having pollution, but it's not like the highest spike we've seen in 20 years, but there's still pollution out there. I think continuing to build awareness around the types of activities people should and shouldn't be doing from a public health mitigation impact. It's, don't go running in the middle of like a smoggy day. And the way ozone works here is like, you can't wait until the afternoon. If you want to go out and be active in the afternoon, we often see the highest air pollution, particularly north of Chicago, as you get up towards the Wisconsin border, happening at like 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, even later than that into the evening. So it's kind of encouraging people and creating the right messaging to let people know that, hey, we're in the middle of a smoggy period right now. You really want to be limiting your outdoor impacts. For outdoor workers, people who have to be outdoors and working, that's a trickier one. If there is fire smoke and a lot of particulate matter, N95 masks can work. They do work. But for ozone, you can't really wear a mask to reduce ozone exposure. So, the thing with ozone is it's also happening with heat. So if people are outside working, they're being exposed to both high heat and high ozone concentrations. Best practices I don't know the best practices for outdoor workers in those types of situations. If we're thinking kind of more generally, not just about mitigation and public health, protecting public health, but like impacts that we can make in our activities, you may have seen these things. Don't mow your lawn in the middle of an ozone episode. Don't gas up. Don't put fuel in your car, particularly in the morning and midday hours during an ozone episode, because you're adding VOCs to the mix. I mean, these things are actually, this type of thing is impactful.
Zach, another one would be if the check engine light on your car is on, that means the pollution control systems are failing or have failed. And you're talking about dozens of times higher emissions. It isn't just the kind of doubling kind of thing. It gets very bad very quickly. And the same with solvents. Don't paint your house when it's a ozone action day. Don't, dump some acetone or clean, brushes or any of those kind of things. If you can smell the solvent, if you can smell it, it smells like a solvent. Don't do that on an ozone action day. That's not gonna help.
Take public transportation, work from home. Just really trying to keep emissions down is what the messaging needs to be around. Oh, you have a good question here, Edith. You've been thinking about this a lot.
I was just going to type the answer and just in out of respect for everybody's time, but I'll answer really quickly on that one. So on the landscape equipment buyback program, the priority climate action plan for the Chicago region, working with Zach and Mark, we did identify the lawn and garden equipment buyback program as viable. So Zach and Mark are going to be helping us with justification for that. We are submitting a climate pollution reduction grant, so a federal grant request. Plan is that we would distribute resources regionally, Dave, so that municipalities that want to participate in the program can. We've got models with Naperville and Elgin that are doing it locally, local sources. Ours would be an actual buyback, as Zach said, is that we're looking to get those older pieces of equipment out of service. And there's also a component working with the commercial landscape industry. So that proposal is going in April 1st, March 31st, whatever, we'll get it done by then. So that's a plan for a regional program. But Dave, there are local examples, Naperville and Elgin.
And some great resources too, I've found through the work with you, Edith, about example like trade industry groups and electrification, lawn and garden electrification equipment policy tools that are out there for people to use to build up their programs.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Dave, this also kind of piggybacked on some regulatory actions. Local governments were banning leaf blowers, and the landscape industry is trying to cope with that. So this is a carrot approach to complement the stick approach that we're seeing in some communities. Okay, I think we should wrap. Thank you so much for staying late, for everybody that stuck with us. We've got some hearty souls. We don't often go over, but this was really just super interesting. And clearly, and you know, we'll have to continue this conversation for another meeting. And really zero in on the things that we can do. So of course, we'll share slides. They'll all be available. Cheryl's just posting the next Environment Committee meeting, another cheery topic on extreme heat and the municipal response, but we've got some cool local experts that have been doing some research also on the municipal role. So that's April 16th via Zoom, and registration right there. So thank you so much,
Thank you,
Zach
Zach.
and Mark, for sharing all that knowledge and making it understandable for us. So, and to everybody who stuck around for a long time.